lightning bolt hits dry grass on the African savanna. Within minutes, the plain is burning. Most animals run. A small group of hominins doesn't. They wait. They watch the flames die down. And then they walk into the smoldering ash, pulling out roasted tubers, scorched seeds, the blackened carcasses of animals that didn't outrun the fire. They didn't build this fire. They didn't understand it. They just ate what it left behind. And that one accident, scavenging a dead wildfire instead of running from it, didn't just give our ancestors a meal. It rewired their guts. It shrank their jaws. It doubled the size of their brains. It gave them language, storytelling, and eventually a genetic mutation the rest of the animal kingdom doesn't have. We like to imagine the discovery of fire as a heroic moment, some genius ancestor rubbing two sticks together in a flash of insight. That's not what happened. For over 1 million years, humans didn't invent fire at all. They just got lucky enough to eat what it cooked, and by the time they figured out how to make it themselves, fire had already rebuilt them from the inside out. Here's how a destructive accident became the reason you're not still swinging through trees. Let's start with the raw truth, literally. Every other primate on Earth eats its food exactly the way nature made it. Raw fruit, raw leaves, raw meat. And to survive on that diet, they pay an enormous price. Great apes spend somewhere between 40% and 70% of their entire waking day just chewing, not hunting. Not socializing. Chewing. Modern humans, less than 5% of our day. That gap, from 70% down to 5%, is one of the strangest transformations in the history of life on Earth, and it starts with something incredibly simple: heat. When you cook starch, heat physically breaks apart the tightly packed crystal structure inside the starch granules, a process called gelatinization, and that lets your digestive enzymes tear it apart far more easily. The result is up to 35% more digestible starch from the exact same food. Cook protein, and heat uncoils the tightly wound structure of the protein molecule, exposing the parts your stomach enzymes need to grab onto. That single change boosts net protein absorption by as much as 78%. Cook meat with fat in it, and heat breaks down the cell walls holding the fat in place, making it dramatically easier for your body to absorb. In other words, cooking is not seasoning. Cooking is pre-digestion. Fire does part of your digestive system's job before the food ever reaches your mouth. And once you see it that way, the next question becomes obvious. What do you do with a body that suddenly doesn't have to work as hard to eat? Here's the problem evolution had to solve. Your brain is metabolically ravenous. It's about 2% of your body weight, and it burns roughly 20% of your entire resting energy budget. For an organ that small, that's an absurd amount of fuel. Under normal mammal rules, you can't just add an organ that expensive. Something else has to shrink to pay for it, or your whole body needs more calories than you can realistically find in a day. This is what researchers Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And cooking is the missing piece that makes the math work. Because if food is already partly broken down by fire before it reaches your gut, you no longer need a massive, energy-hungry digestive tract to ferment and process raw, fibrous material. So the gut shrinks by an estimated 40% compared to what a primate our size should have. Look at the anatomical trail this leaves behind. Australopithecines, broad ribcage, big gut, heavy jaw, small brain, around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus, narrower waist, smaller gut, lighter jaw, brain expanding to 850 to 1,100 cubic centimeters. Homo sapiens, compact digestive tract, small teeth, and a brain topping out around 1,300 to 1,500 cubic centimeters. That's not a coincidence lined up in the fossil record. That's a trade. The gut got smaller, so the brain could get bigger. And cooking is what made the trade possible in the first place. But this raises an uncomfortable question. Is this something we can actually test, or is it just a convenient theory? Turns out, we don't have to guess. People have tried living the before-fire way, and the results aren't subtle. In the Gießen raw food study, researchers tracked people who committed to eating 100% raw diets. And this wasn't primitive food either. It was modern, energy-dense raw ingredients. Oils, nuts, fruit. Even with that kind of access, over 30% of the women in the study developed chronic loss of their menstrual cycle, and many of the men experienced ongoing, involuntary weight loss. Their bodies simply could not pull enough usable energy out of raw food to keep functioning normally, even in the 21st century, with a supermarket's worth of options. And it's not just a human quirk. Researchers studying Burmese pythons found that snakes digesting cooked meat used 12 to 15% less metabolic energy to break it down, compared to digesting it raw. Across an entire branch of the animal kingdom, completely unrelated to humans, heat does the same trick. It makes digestion cheaper. So this isn't a story we made up to feel special. It's a measurable, repeatable biological fact. Humans are the one species that became biologically dependent on doing something to our food before we eat it. Which brings us to a mistake almost everyone makes when they think about calories. Every nutrition label you've ever read uses something called the Atwater system, and it treats raw and cooked calories as if they're identical. They're not. The whole point of gelatinization, denaturation, and fat breakdown is that they change how much energy your body can actually extract, not how much energy is technically in the food. A raw sweet potato and a cooked sweet potato are not nutritionally the same food, even though a label would tell you they are. This isn't a minor technicality. It means our entire modern framework for counting calories is built on an assumption that's been wrong since the moment cooking entered the human diet, over 1 million years ago. Which leads to the next question worth asking. If cooking is this powerful, when did our ancestors actually start doing it on purpose? This is where it gets tricky, because fire doesn't leave the kind of evidence you'd expect. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, researchers found microscopic layers of burnt plant ash and calcined bone fragments, 30 meters inside the cave, far from daylight. Natural wildfires can't reach that deep into a cave. Somebody had to carry the fire in. That evidence dates back as far as 1.79 million years. At Evron Quarry in Israel, scientists couldn't find any visible burn marks at all, no soot, no char. So they used Raman spectroscopy and AI-assisted analysis instead, and found that flints and an elephant tusk fragment had been heated to between 200 degrees Celsius and 600 degrees Celsius, roughly 1 to 0.8 million years ago. The fire damage was there. It was just invisible to the naked eye. At Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, archaeologists found what they call phantom hearths, spots where the actual ash had dissolved away over hundreds of thousands of years, but clusters of tiny, thermally altered flint fragments still marked exactly where a fire once burned, 780,000 years ago. And then, by the time you reach Kazim Cave, dated between 420,000 and 200,000 years ago, the evidence stops being subtle entirely. There's a 300,000-year-old central hearth, thick layers of wood ash, roasted bones, and even microscopic charcoal particles preserved in the hardened dental plaque of the people who breathed that smoke every day. So somewhere between scavenging a dead wildfire and building a hearth in the middle of your cave and roasting meat around it as a group, something fundamental changed. And that change is still being argued about today. Not everyone agrees on when fire went from accident to habit. One camp, Researchers like Richard Wrangham, Rachel Carmody, and John Gowlett argues fire control started early, around 1.8 to 1.5 million years ago, right when Homo erectus first shows up in the fossil record, with a smaller jaw, smaller gut, and bigger brain. Their case: you don't get that anatomical shift without the extra energy that cooking provides. The other camp, researchers like Will Robrooks, Paula Villa, and Dennis Sandgoth, pushes back. They argue that clear, unmistakable hearths don't really show up until around 400,000 years ago. Before that, they say, hominins may have just been opportunistically using fire when they came across it, not truly controlling it. Right now, the confidence levels look like this. Scientists are fairly confident, somewhere around 75 to 85%, that hominins were scavenging wildfires as early as 1.5 to 1 million years ago. But they're extremely confident, above 95%, that by 400,000 years ago, humans had fully mastered fire as a daily, deliberate tool. Either way, once fire became a fixture of daily life, it didn't just change what humans ate. It changed what happened after the sun went down. Before fire, night was simple. It was dangerous, and you slept through it. Firelight changed that. It suppresses melatonin, the hormone that makes you feel sleepy, which meant early humans could stay alert and active roughly 4 extra hours into the night. But here's the interesting part. That extra time wasn't useful for the things that filled the daytime. You can't forage in the dark. You can't really nap stone tools by firelight. So this new block of time was, in a sense, economically useless, and it got filled with something else entirely. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner studied conversations among the Jew/Huanzi Bushmen and found a stark split. Daytime talk was almost entirely economic planning, complaints. Gossip used to keep people in line. But at night, around the fire, over 80% of conversation shifted to storytelling. Myths, shared histories, songs. That useless fire-lit time became the birthplace of narrative, of shared belief, of the ability to imagine what's going on in someone else's head, what researchers call theory of mind. Fire didn't just cook dinner. It created the very first stage for human culture to perform on. And while all of this was happening around the flames, something even stranger was happening inside the human body, at the level of DNA. Fire comes with a cost: smoke. And wood smoke is full of toxic compounds, including polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which bind to a receptor in your cells called AHR and can cause serious damage, respiratory problems, immune suppression, even reproductive failure. Modern humans carry a specific mutation in that AHR gene, a single amino acid substitution that makes it 100 times harder for those smoke toxins to bind and cause damage. Neanderthals didn't have it. Denisovans didn't have it. Non-human primates don't have it. We're the only ones who got the upgrade that let us actually live inside smoke-filled caves without it slowly poisoning us or our children. And it doesn't stop there. Humans also carry extra copies of a gene called AMY1, which lets our saliva start breaking down cooked gelatinized starch the moment it hits our mouth, something other primates can't do nearly as well. And around 1.8 to 2.4 million years ago, a separate mutation quietly disabled a jaw muscle gene called MYH16, shrinking our chewing muscles and relieving pressure on the skull, which may have helped clear the way for our brain case to expand. 3 completely separate pieces of our DNA, one for tolerating smoke, one for digesting cooked starch, one for allowing our skull to grow, all pointing to the same conclusion. Fire didn't just change human behavior, it rewrote the human genome. So let's clear up the myths this whole story tends to attract. Fire wasn't invented before it was used. It was scavenged from natural wildfires, for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone figured out how to strike a spark on purpose. Meat alone didn't build the human brain. Raw meat is still tough to chew and expensive to digest. It took cooking of both meat and starchy plants to unlock the energy required. And fire's biggest evolutionary win wasn't warmth or protection from predators. As valuable as those were, its real power was digestion. Free calories, extracted more efficiently night after night for hundreds of thousands of years. So here's where it leaves us. An accident with a wildfire didn't just feed our ancestors. It re-engineered their bodies, rewired their brains, and even edited their genes. But there's a question this raises that we haven't answered yet. If cooked food built the modern human brain, what happens when a body raised on 1,000,000 years of cooked calories suddenly goes back to eating raw? We touched on the Geeson study briefly, but the full story of what happens to the human body on a raw food diet today is stranger and more revealing than you'd expect. That's exactly what we're breaking down in the next video. So if you want to understand what fire built by seeing what happens when you try to undo it, that's the one to watch next.